Prescott, Maine. The year is 1858 and death lingers in every home. Winters are merciless. Coughs become funerals. Children vanish overnight. Their bodies carried out before the fire in the morning chill. Black crepe hangs from doorknobs. Church bells toll so often that their sound is less warning than routine. Graveyards spread across the edges of town, swollen with headstones that mark not just lives lost, but the constant reminder that anyone at any moment could be next. But among all the deaths that year, one family's loss carved itself into legend. Not for the fever that claimed two brothers, not for the grief that followed, but for the photograph that remains, a post-mortem portrait. Two young boys, dressed in stiff Sunday clothes, laid gently side by side. Their eyelids closed, their faces pale. A portrait meant to console a family, to preserve memory in a time when memory was fragile. But the photograph of the Prescott brothers was not consoling. It was unsettling. Neighbors who saw it could not look for long. They whispered that the boys' cheeks were too flushed, that their lips seemed taut, not slack in death but trembling with withheld breath, that their small hands, folded neatly over their chests, did not look rigid with rigor mortis, but loose, malleable, as if someone had to place them again and again until the pose would hold. The official story said fever had taken them quickly, that they were gone before the doctor arrived. But the whispers told something darker, that the Prescott brothers were still alive. Imagine for a moment being their parents, faced with illness, uncertainty, panic, a doctor with little more than guesses declaring the boys dead. No stethoscope sensitive enough to detect shallow breaths, no monitors to prove finality. Only silence, or something close to it. And then, imagine a decision, to summon the photographer, to dress the bodies, to pose them, to capture the image before the earth claimed them. But what if the stillness was not death, but terror? Whispers began almost immediately. The photographer's young assistant told a friend years later that something about the session had been wrong. That during the long exposure, when the boys had to remain perfectly still, he saw one hand twitch, just a fraction, enough to make him flinch. When he tried to speak, the photographer silenced him sharply. Hold the pose. Say nothing. And then came the sound, a faint wetness in the breath, like someone exhaling slowly through a cracked mouth. The assistant swore he heard it, but again the photographer snapped, "It's only your nerves." But nerves cannot explain what happened after. The photograph was taken, the plates were developed. The boys were lowered into coffins, nailed shut, buried in family ground. And for a moment, it seemed the story might end there, with grief and silence. But silence did not last. Within nights, neighbors walking past the graveyard claimed they heard faint cries. Not wind, not owls. Cries, low and desperate, muffled beneath the soil. The sheriff dismissed it as imagination. The minister begged people not to spread fear. But the whispers spread anyway, from kitchen to kitchen, pew to pew. Children dared each other to step near the Prescott plot after dark. Some swore they saw the ground shift, as though something beneath still moved. Parents pulled them away, insisting it was blasphemy. But deep down, everyone wondered, had the Prescotts buried their sons alive? Premature burial was not a fantasy of the 19th century. It was a terror. Doctors struggled to define death with certainty. A faint pulse might go undetected. Shallow breaths mistaken for none at all. Dozens of pamphlets circulated warning against hasty burials. How to tell the living from the dead. Newspapers carried advertisements for safety coffins, fitted with bells or pipes so the not quite dead could call for rescue. And still, mistakes were made. One Boston medical journal recorded the case of a woman who awoke mid-autopsy, only to die again from shock. Another told of graves exhumed during cemetery expansions, their coffins scarred with scratch marks, their corpses twisted, jaws stretched open in silent screams. So when whispers spread in Prescott, they were not dismissed as impossible. They were feared because they were entirely possible. 9 years later, during another epidemic, the town cemetery was disturbed. New graves had to be made and old coffins shifted. Among them, the Prescott plot was opened. What they found inside has never been agreed upon. 3 versions survive, each one worse than the last. The official story, the one repeated by church elders, said the boys' skeletons were found as expected, laid side by side, still, peaceful. But others whispered differently, that the inside of the coffin lid bore deep gouges torn by fingernails, that the wood itself seemed shredded from within, as though the boys had clawed for air until their last strength gave out. And then there is the darkest version. When the coffin was opened, the brothers were not lying flat at all. Their bodies were twisted sideways, arms raised, jaws open wide as if caught mid-scream. No record exists in writing. No newspaper dared publish it. But the whispers have never faded. The photograph itself remains, passed in secret between collectors, tucked away in drawers, occasionally surfacing at auctions before vanishing again into private hands. Every time it appears, the same debates return. Some swear you can see the younger brother's lips parted, mid-breath, that you can detect moisture, the faint shimmer of sweat, something no embalming could explain. Others claim the elder brother's eyes are not fully closed, that under close inspection, a thin line of iris peeks beneath the lashes, frozen in a half-gaze. And then there is the weight of the image itself. People who hold it describe a sense of being watched, of unease settling in the chest, heavy, suffocating, as though the photograph remembers what the earth tried to keep. So, were the Prescott brothers truly dead when the shutter clicked? Or does this single photograph capture something far more horrifying? Not the peace of the dead, but the despair of the living, posed and silenced as corpses. That question haunts Prescott still. No one speaks it openly. No one wants to disturb the graves again. But the photograph lingers, daring us to look closer. And tonight we do. We return to the parlor, to the moment the camera shutter fell. We return to the graves. We dig into the silence that the town tried to bury, and into the whispers that refused to die. Because the truth about the Prescott brothers may not be whether they died of fever. It may be that they died of something far worse, buried alive. The earth keeps its secrets. The photograph waits. And tonight, we open both. Welcome back to Truth Uncaged. If you've been here before, you already know this is not the place for comfort. This is the place where we lift the stones history tried to keep heavy, where the things we find are not polished artifacts, but bones, dust, and whispers that were never meant to surface. Tonight, we are not just looking at a photograph. We are staring into the uneasy boundary between life and death, a boundary that in 1858 was blurred beyond recognition. Death photography. It sounds grotesque now, doesn't it? But in the 19th century, it was almost ordinary. Cameras were expensive, fragile, rare. Families often could not afford to capture the living. But when death came, they paid for one final portrait. The last chance to hold on. The only image that might survive. Mothers posed their infants as if they were sleeping, ribbons in their hair. Husbands sat upright in chairs, eyes painted open, wives clinging beside them. Photographers carried arsenals of props to create the illusion of life, of peace, of sleep. But the photograph of the Prescott brothers was different. Too raw, too uncanny, too unsettling. It wasn't grief-preserved. It was dreadful. And here's where I turn the question to you. If you were a neighbor in 1858 and you saw this photograph, if you noticed the flush in their cheeks, the parted lips, the faint line of iris beneath one boy's lashes, would you have spoken? Would you have dared to whisper, "They are not dead"? Or would you have buried your suspicion as quickly as the coffins, knowing that to question death itself was to risk ridicule, fear, even condemnation by the church? Tell me in the comments, because this story isn't just about the Prescott brothers. It's about how silence buries truth, and how truth, like the living, sometimes claws to the surface. The fear of being buried alive was not rare in the 1800s. It was an epidemic. Doctors confessed, even in journals, that they could not always be sure when life ended. There are stories, dozens of them, of corpses that were not corpses at all. People declared dead, only to awaken when their coffins were reopened. Some clawed their way partway out. Others were found twisted, their fingers bloodied from scratching at the wood. One doctor in New York claimed to have personally witnessed 3 premature burials within his career. A French medical society recorded at least 219 cases in a single decade, and newspapers across Europe and America printed tales of safety coffins, contraptions fitted with bells, pipes, or flags, so that the buried could signal the living if they awoke. But Prescott, Maine did not have safety coffins. It had silence, and silence is dangerous. Think of the assistant in the Prescott parlor, a young boy, maybe 16, apprenticing under a photographer expected to obey. He swore years later that he heard one of the brothers breathe during the exposure, or years later that he heard one of the brothers breathe during the exposure. He claimed he saw fingers twitch, If you were him, what would you have done? Interrupt the session? Accuse the doctor, the parents, the minister of burying their children alive? Or swallow your terror, say nothing, and let the nails seal the coffin? These are not idle questions. They are the very questions that hover over this photograph. Because here's the truth. We may never prove whether the Prescott brothers were alive when the camera clicked. But the fear of it, the possibility of it, is enough to curdle the blood. And that is why the story survived. Not in newspapers, not in records, but in whispers, in tremors of memory, passed down quietly through families who swore they saw something wrong in the picture. Even now, collectors who have held the image say the same thing. It feels wrong. As if the photograph does not capture stillness but suppression. Not peace but panic. So tonight, as we open this case, I invite you to sit with an uncomfortable thought. What if death, as we picture it, is not always the truth? What if, beneath the weight of centuries, there are hundreds, maybe thousands, of photographs that do not show the dead, but the dying? And how many of those photographs are still out there, tucked in albums, framed on walls, their subjects screaming silently through the ages? This is why Truth Uncaged exists, to pull back the veil, to ask what others are too uneasy to confront. So I ask you again, if you had been in Prescott in 1858, standing at the edge of that funeral, watching those two small coffins lowered into the earth, while the sound of coughing and shovels filled the air, would you have spoken up? Or would you have stood in silence, knowing that the moment you spoke, the town would turn its suspicion on you? Comment below, because your answer matters. Because in stories like this, silence is not neutral. It is a choice. And as you'll see in the coming sections, the silence around the Prescott brothers was louder than screams. The photograph waits, the graves wait, and we are only at the beginning. Prescott, Maine. A quiet town where the streets emptied at dusk, and the windows went dark as though the houses themselves were holding their breath. By day, it looked ordinary. Horse carts creaking across dirt roads, children playing by the creek, the church bell dividing the hours. But at night, when the fog rolled in from the marsh, Prescott became something else entirely. A place where silence pressed too heavy, and every shadow felt like it belonged to someone watching. In 1858, death was not rare here. It walked into homes without knocking, carried on the back of fever, consumption, or the cruel chill of winter. Families knew how to mourn, but they also knew how quickly a mistake could be made. For in those years, the line between life and death was as thin as the whisper of a breath, and sometimes that whisper went unheard. Today we trust machines to measure a heartbeat, a pulse, a final breath. In the 1850s, such certainty didn't exist. Doctors judged by touch, by sight, by crude tests that could fail in the most horrifying ways. A mirror pressed to the lips for fog. A candle flame placed near the mouth. A needle jabbed under a fingernail. But what if the chest still carried a faint rise? What if the pulse was only hidden, weak but present? Many did not ask these questions. They accepted silence as final. And the result was a nightmare whispered in hushed tones across New England. The nightmare of premature burial. There are records of coffins exhumed to reveal scratch marks clawed into the wood from within, of bodies twisted in unnatural contortions, frozen in the last agony of suffocation. These were not legends, they were documented cases too many to dismiss. And every time such a story spread, it fed a deeper fear. What if it happened here in Prescott? Into this landscape of fear entered a peculiar ritual, one that blurred the line between reverence and horror. Post-mortem photography. It was not rare in 1858. Families who could not afford a portrait in life paid dearly for one in death. Photographers would arrive with their heavy cameras, arranging bodies with unsettling care. Some were laid in coffins surrounded by flowers. Others were propped up as if sitting for a casual likeness. Children were often posed in their parents' arms, their eyes painted open on the photograph's surface, creating the illusion of life. To grieving families, these images were keepsakes. To us, they are unsettling, too intimate, too unnatural. But the photograph of the Prescott brothers unsettled even their own neighbors, men and women who were already accustomed to such images. The boys looked wrong. Their lips were parted as if caught in mid-breath. Their cheeks seemed flushed, not drained. Their fingers appeared stiff but curved, as if resisting, not resting. One neighbor, a woman named Clara Whitfield, swore she could see dampness near the boys' mouths. Another claimed the younger child's head had shifted slightly between exposures. The photographer himself never spoke of it again. Elias and Margaret Prescott were not remarkable people. He worked as a tradesman, stern and practical, while she was known for her quiet frailty. Their home sat at the edge of town, shaded by oaks whose branches rattled in the wind like skeletal hands. Their children, however, were lively. The two brothers, Thomas and Henry, were remembered for their laughter, their mischief, their endless games that carried them through fields and woods. Neighbors recalled seeing them just weeks before, sticks in hand, shouting pretend orders like soldiers at war. To imagine such energy snuffed out so suddenly felt wrong. The official cause was fever, said to have struck one boy, then the other in rapid succession. But whispers suggested something darker, that one child had died, and in grief or haste, the second was declared gone too soon. The photograph only fanned those whispers into fire. In Prescott, the grave was not final. Everyone knew the stories. Coffins that moaned when the earth pressed too heavy. Graves disturbed though no burial had been performed. A farmer once claimed he heard scratching beneath the soil when working near the cemetery at dusk, a sound he described as clawing like a trapped animal. He never went back. Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Premature Burial, had been published less than a decade earlier, and its chilling details, a man waking in darkness buried alive, were read in Prescott like prophecy. It seemed less like fiction and more like an echo of fears they already carried. So when the Prescott brothers were laid to rest, the town should have felt closure. But instead there was unease. Something about their deaths, their photograph, and the swiftness of their burial whispered of unfinished business. The image is gone now, lost to time, but fragments of its description survive in journals and oral accounts. The boys sat side by side, dressed in their Sunday best. Their faces were too vivid, their skin too flushed. One child's lips were slightly open, as though caught in a final gasp. Some swore the elder boy's eyelids were not fully shut, that beneath them a sliver of eye showed, glinting faintly in the light. Others insisted the younger boy's hand appeared to clutch at his lap, frozen in unnatural tension. The longer people looked, the more they saw, and the more they saw, the less they slept. Prescott was not a place where scandal lived long. To accuse the doctor of error or the Prescotts of haste would have been unthinkable. The town buried its doubts with the boys, just as the coffins were lowered into the earth. But silence does not erase fear, it only amplifies it. The photograph became a ghost in itself, its image carried in whispers and nightmares. Some said the boys screamed beneath the soil. Others swore their cries could be heard on windless nights, faint and desperate, rising from the churchyard. Whether these were true events or the fevered imagination of a fearful town, no one could say. But the effect was the same. Prescott, Maine, had become a place where people hurried past the graveyard after dark, refusing to glance at the earth that covered the Prescott brothers. And so we return to the moment. 1858, a family in mourning, a town wrapped in silence, a photograph too disturbing to forget. What really happened to the Prescott brothers? Were they truly claimed by fever as the records state, or were they claimed by something far more horrifying? A mistake so damning it was buried under earth and secrecy. The questions do not rest, the photograph does not rest. And soon, neither will you. Because what comes next is not a rumor. It is evidence, and it will change everything. The first sign came quietly, not in a shout, not in a scream, but in a whisper, carried on the lips of neighbors who had seen too much and could not bring themselves to look away. It began with the photograph itself. At first glance, it was nothing more than another post-mortem portrait, the kind of grim keepsake every family seemed to own. But when the light hit the paper just right, details revealed themselves that should not have been there. A flush of color where death should have left only pallor. A curve of the fingers where rigor mortis should have locked them stiff. And worst of all, a parting of lips that looked less like repose and more like the faintest breath. The man behind the camera, a journeyman named Caleb Dwyer, was said to have gone pale when he developed the plate. He had photographed dozens of corpses, some hours dead, some already days gone. He knew what death looked like. But these boys did not look dead. According to a letter later attributed to him, Dwyer wrote, The eyes of the elders seemed to stir under their lids. I told myself it was a trick of the exposure, yet I could not shake the sense that they looked back at me as though pleading. He never returned to the Prescott house. He never spoke of the photograph again. Some said he destroyed the plate. Others insisted it remained hidden in his trunk until his death. Either way, his silence became the first clue that the Prescott brothers' story was not finished. They were buried quickly. Too quickly, some thought. Fever was feared, and bodies were often rushed into the ground before contagion could spread. But to bury 2 children within a single day, it struck some as haste born not only of caution, but of fear. A neighbor claimed she watched Elias Prescott, the father, wipe sweat from his brow as the coffins were lowered. Not the sweat of grief, she said, but of panic. His hands trembled so badly, he nearly dropped the rope. Why the rush? Why the trembling? Whispers bloomed in the silence of the graveyard. The town should have rested after the burial. Instead, the graveyard became a place of unease. On the first night, a man walking home from the tavern swore he heard a sound from the fresh earth. A muffled cry, he told no one. Who would believe a drunkard staggering home in the fog? But he never walked that path again. On the second night, another story emerged. A farmer returning late from his fields claimed he saw lantern light moving among the gravestones. It bobbed and swayed as though someone searched the ground in secret. When he called out, the light vanished. By morning, the soil atop the Prescott plot looked disturbed, damp, sunken in the middle, as if something beneath had shifted. Margaret Prescott was never the same after her son's burial. Neighbors reported seeing her slip into the churchyard at night, lantern in hand, standing over the graves for hours. Some swore they heard her speaking softly, as if to the boys themselves. Others said she did more than speak, that she pressed her ear to the soil, listening before staggering back home in a fit of sobs. One account, passed down in the Whitfield family, claimed Margaret whispered to her sister, "They are not at rest. I still hear them." If this was true, then she knew, or feared, that her sons had been buried alive. Weeks later, when the ground began to settle, boys from the town dared each other to poke around the Prescott plot. Children have no fear until it is too late. They dug at the edges, prying loose small bits of the coffin lid through damp soil. What they saw sent them running, screaming back into town. The wood was marked, scored from within, scratches, dozens of them. Adults dismissed it as childish imagination. No one went to look. But those boys grew up swearing it was true, swearing that the Prescott brothers had tried to claw their way out. By now, unease had spread through Prescott like rot. People locked their doors earlier. Some avoided the graveyard altogether. And yet, no one confronted the family. No one dared to open the graves. Why? Perhaps it was fear of what they might find. Perhaps it was a shame. For if the boys truly had been buried alive, it was not just the Prescott's error, but the town's. The doctor who declared them gone, the neighbors who stood at the funeral, the minister who blessed the soil. To dig would be to admit guilt. To dig would be to face the horror. So they chose silence. And silence is where horror thrives. The photograph did not vanish. It lingered in whispers, in memories. Each retelling added another layer of unease. Some claimed that when you looked long enough, the boys' expressions changed. That their lips curled not in peace but in pain. That their heads tilted ever so slightly, as though straining against unseen weight. One widow swore the younger child's hand shifted position every time she looked, clenched tighter, then looser as though still struggling. She burned her copy of the image in her hearth, and neighbors said she slept better afterward, but others kept it. Some said they had to, as if destroying it might silence the only proof the boys had ever given of their suffering. It was no longer a rumor, no longer imagination. There was evidence now, a photographer who swore their eyes moved, a mother who whispered she heard them, a grave that sank as if something stirred beneath, a coffin lid marked with scratches. These fragments alone were unsettling. Together, they formed a pattern. The pattern suggested one thing only. The Prescott brothers had not gone quietly into death. They had been buried too soon. Even with this evidence, the town said nothing. The Prescotts carried on, hollow and pale. The photograph disappeared into secrecy. The graveyard grew weeds. But unease has a way of surfacing. Just as the boy's hands clawed upward, the truth clawed through layers of silence. And this was only the first clue. The first whisper of something much darker, because the true revelations had not yet begun. It could not be contained forever. For weeks, the whispers pressed at the edges of the town like smoke under a door. Mothers crossed themselves when they passed the graveyard. Fathers drew their children close when the Prescotts walked by. And still, no one spoke aloud what all of them thought. What if the boys were not dead when the earth closed over them? The silence might have lasted if not for one terrible sight. Late in the spring of 1858, heavy rains swept through the town, tearing gullies into the churchyard soil. Graves that had rested undisturbed for decades suddenly bore the marks of water, their outlines caving and sinking into themselves. The Prescott plot was among them. When dawn broke after the storm, parishioners arriving for morning prayers found the ground sunken nearly a foot, the wooden lid of the coffin faintly visible through the washed-out soil. Worse than that, they saw what no one wanted to admit, small fragments of wood protruding upward, splintered, as though broken from within. The minister ordered the soil quickly replaced, but not before several onlookers swore they saw marks. Deep scratches clawed into the underside of the lid, visible through the cracks of broken timber. A boy named Jonathan Hales whispered, "They tried to get out. I saw where their nails tore at the wood." His father silenced him with a blow. But the damage was done. The town could not unsee it. Sheriff Amos Ridley was not a man eager to stir scandal. He was known for preferring his office chair to the saddle, his pipe to his pistol. But as the whispers grew louder, even he was forced to act. Reluctantly, he agreed to visit the Prescott's home. He found Elias Prescott at the hearth, staring into flames that had long since burned down to ash. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken, his voice barely more than a rasp. When asked about the burial, Elias gave no answer. When pressed about the scratches, he turned his gaze upward to the rafters and muttered, "Some noises are best left beneath the earth." The sheriff left with nothing except the unease that clung to him like cold sweat. Not all stayed silent. One voice rose against the tide, trembling but insistent. Abigail Moore, the town's midwife, swore she had been present on the night the boys fell ill. She claimed the doctor was hasty in declaring them gone. She had leaned close, too close, and thought she felt a faint breath on the younger boy's lips. When she told Elias, he slammed his hand upon the table and forbade her from speaking another word. The doctor ordered her from the room, and within an hour the boys were in their coffins. Abigail's testimony was dismissed as the ramblings of a hysterical woman. But in the months that followed, she told her story again and again, and each time it grew darker. She said she still woke in the night to the sound of scratching. Not on her door, not on her window, but beneath her floorboards. Finally, the pressure broke. One night, a group of townsmen gathered in the tavern, voices hushed but urgent. They decided, against the minister's warning, against the Prescott's silence, that the graves must be opened. Not for curiosity, not for cruelty, but for certainty. They gathered by lantern light, shovels in hand, and crept to the graveyard long after midnight. The rain-soaked earth gave way easily, too easily, and soon the coffin lid lay exposed once more. It was then that doubt turned to horror. The wood was not intact. It bore the marks of struggle, deep gouges, broken splinters, faint traces of blood embedded in the grain, and the nails hammered in haste by the carpenter, were bent outward as though forced by pressure within. The men recoiled. One swore he heard movement still, a shifting within the box. Another swore the younger brother's voice whispered his name. In terror, they dropped their tools and fled, leaving the grave half open to the night. At dawn, the minister found what had been done. With trembling hands, he ordered the grave resealed. He called it blasphemy, desecration, sin. From the pulpit, he thundered that the dead must not be disturbed, that the devil himself could twist the senses of weak men in the dark. But even as he spoke, his voice cracked, and those who sat closest swore they saw sweat glistening at his temple, his hands gripping the lectern too tightly. The minister had seen the scratches too. Amid this unrest, the photograph resurfaced. Someone, no one ever admitted who, placed it quietly on the church steps one morning. It leaned against the door like an accusation. When the congregation arrived, they froze. The boys stared back at them from the faded plate, eyes closed, lips parted. And something was different now, or perhaps they only noticed what had always been there. The younger brother's hand was curled in a fist. The elder's lips seemed parted not in rest, but in a scream caught mid-breath. No one touched it. No one claimed it. By the end of the day, the photograph was gone again. But not before its image seared itself into every mind that saw it. The investigation had begun, but there was no official inquiry. No sheriff's record, no minister's declaration, only the restless scratching of conscience growing louder each day. The Prescotts stopped attending church. Margaret's lantern no longer flickered in the graveyard at night. Elias vanished for days at a time, returning with soil beneath his nails. And always the whispers grew. Some said the boys had been heard knocking on the coffin lid beneath the earth. Some said their cries echoed through the churchyard on moonless nights. Some said their restless spirits were no longer bound to the soil, but roamed the town, looking for someone, anyone, who might finally set them free. By now, the town was trapped in a paradox. They had uncovered enough to know the truth, that the Prescott brothers had not died peacefully. And yet, no one dared to complete the work. The coffins remained closed. The photograph remained hidden. The Prescotts remained silent. The investigation had begun, but it had no end, because the greatest horror was not what the town had discovered. It was what they refused to face. Weeks turned to months. The whispers dulled, then sharpened again with each storm. Each fresh sinkhole in the graveyard soil. The boys remained buried, but in the minds of the townspeople, they were never at rest. And so, the investigation lingered in a kind of purgatory. Not alive, not dead, just like the brothers themselves on that terrible night in 1858. The truth had been clawing upward, and the town had chosen to bury it again. But it would not stay buried, because soon, revelations would come. Revelations so grotesque that even the most hardened would wish the coffins had never been opened at all. For months, the town tried to bury its doubts as deeply as the Prescotts had buried their sons. But truth, like water, seeps through soil, and eventually it will rise. It began with another storm. The summer of 1858 was brutal. Weeks of rain gave way to sudden heat, then rain again. By late July, the graveyard sagged with puddles, and the Prescott plot once more bore the scars of erosion. Children dared each other to run between the tilted headstones, their laughter echoing off the church walls. One of them, young Martha Coates, tripped near the Prescott grave. When she pushed herself up, her hand fell against something that should never have been there. Wood. Splintered, warped, smelling of rot. She screamed. The other children fled, and by evening the whole town knew that the Prescott coffins had surfaced again. This time the sheriff could not ignore it. He ordered the graves opened, if only to restore decency. But what was found beneath the lid silenced the entire crowd. The first coffin was pried open with crowbars, the wood screeching like an animal in pain. When the lid lifted, a stench of damp earth rolled out. Gasps followed. The boy inside and the elder brother lay twisted. His body was not at rest but contorted, his arms bent awkwardly upward, his fingers shattered, the nails torn and bloodied. The lining of the coffin was shredded into ribbons, and on the underside of the lid, scratches. Hundreds of them. Some shallow, some deep, gouged in frantic, desperate bursts. The kind of marks made by a child clawing in the dark. The crowd recoiled. One woman fainted. When the second coffin was opened, it was worse. The younger brother's face was frozen in an expression no artist could capture, no minister could soften. His mouth gaped, teeth bared, lips torn where he had bitten down upon himself. His eyes, clouded and sunken, still seemed wide in horror, and in his hands, clutched like a talisman, were scraps of cloth, torn from his own burial shroud. The crowd scattered, unable to look. Dr. Hammond, the man who had declared the boys dead, was summoned. He arrived pale, trembling, his hat twisting between his hands. He bent over the coffins only briefly before stepping back, muttering something about premature burial and rare instances. When pressed, he refused to elaborate. Some said his silence was fear of the Prescotts' wrath. Others whispered darker things, that he had known all along, that the burial had been deliberate. Whatever the truth, the doctor never again walked the town without feeling eyes upon him, heavy and accusing. As if summoned by the horror, the photograph returned. This time, It was found not on the church steps, but nailed to the door of the sheriff's office. The faded image of the Prescott boys stared outward, their expressions unchanged. And yet, after what had been found in the graves, the picture now seemed transformed. The elder brother's parted lips looked less like sleep, more like a muffled cry. The younger's clenched hand seemed less like repose, more like defiance. The townspeople began to murmur that the photograph was cursed, that it appeared when the boys were restless, that it would not vanish until their story was told. The sheriff tore it down. By morning, another copy appeared in its place. The father, Elias, did not speak in his own defense, but those who saw him after the exhumation swore he had changed. He wandered the fields at night, muttering to himself. He dug holes in the yard with bare hands, filling them again before dawn. He no longer entered the church. When confronted, he snarled that his sons were where they belonged. One night he was heard shouting from his porch, bellowing into the darkness, "You wanted them back? Take them, dig them up and see what your curiosity has brought you." After that, few dared to pass the Prescott home. The final piece of evidence came from the minister himself. For weeks, he had preached about silence, about leaving the dead undisturbed. But one Sunday, he faltered. Mid-sermon, he froze, his eyes fixed on the back pew. Then, in a trembling voice, he confessed that he too had seen the bodies when the coffins were opened, and he admitted that he had heard scratching the night of their burial. Not in the graveyard, in the church itself, from beneath the floorboards where the coffins had rested before burial. The congregation erupted. Some screamed, others wept, and the minister collapsed at the pulpit, sobbing into his hands. There was no denying it now. The Prescott brothers had been buried alive, and their struggle had been ignored. The evidence lay carved into the wood, into the shredded lining, into the broken fingers of boys who had clawed at their prison until the last breath left them. No whisper could cover that. No sermon could soften it. The town had its proof, and with proof came shame. But here lies the greater horror. The revelations did not bring justice. The coffins were resealed, the ground was consecrated again, and the town agreed in quiet consensus that the matter would go no further. There would be no trial for Dr. Hammond, no condemnation for Elias Prescott, no word carried to neighboring towns, because the truth was too much to bear. Better to bury it again, deeper this time, under layers of silence. Yet the photograph would not allow it. For months afterward, it appeared in strange places, nailed to doors, left upon windowsills, tucked into prayer books. Always the same image, fading and frayed, yet unmistakable. Children swore the boys' eyes moved in the picture, following them. Adults swore the mouths changed, curling into screams when the lantern light flickered. And though every copy was eventually burned or torn, another always appeared. The town had its proof, but it would never have peace. To this day, records from 1858 carry a gap, a silence where notes should have been. The Prescott's names are listed in ledgers, but the cause of their children's death is left blank. The doctor's notes from that year are missing. The minister's sermons abruptly shift, week to week, from thunderous to broken, with no explanation. But the grave remains, and locals say, on storm-heavy nights you can still hear scratching in the churchyard. Not loud, not violent, just steady, as though the boys still claw at the wood, waiting for someone, anyone, to finish what the town refused to do. Tell the truth. And perhaps the darkest revelation of all is not the evidence of the coffins, not the photograph, not the confessions. It is this: everyone knew, from the midwife who felt a faint breath, to the doctor who closed his eyes and signed a certificate, to the father who rushed the burial, to the minister who heard scratching in the church. Everyone knew, and everyone chose silence. The Prescott brothers were not just buried alive in wood and soil, they were buried alive in complicity. And that perhaps is the cruelest evidence of all. The town of Harper's Ferry thought it could bury its shame. But the dead do not rest when their story remains untold. And soon, the Prescott brothers were not only haunting their family, they were haunting the world beyond. The sheriff's men tried to keep it quiet. The minister swore to the congregation to silence. The doctor disappeared into his practice and locked his doors. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. By autumn of 1858, travelers passing through the valley began to whisper about a burial gone wrong. Some claimed to have seen the coffins themselves. Others said the boys had been buried twice, once in wood and once in lies. And in taverns from Winchester to Shepherdstown, a rumor began to spread. 2 brothers buried alive by their own blood. Only one newspaper attempted to print the story. The Charleston Gazette, in November of that year, carried a single paragraph. Carefully worded, stripped of names, but unmistakable in its meaning. Reports circulate of a family interment most unnatural. A pair of young brothers, presumed lost to fever, have been found with signs that suggest their deaths came not from illness, but from premature burial. The evidence is so grave that the town declines further comment. The issue was pulled within days. Remaining copies were confiscated. But in that brief window, dozens of readers saw it, and dozens more repeated it. The Prescott secret was no longer confined to Harper's Ferry. Dr. Hammond, once a respected man, could not withstand the weight of rumor. His patients stopped knocking at his door. Mothers refused to let him touch their children. One morning, his house stood empty. The shutters banged in the wind, the door half open, the furniture left as though he had walked out in haste. On his desk, a single note was found. It read, "They breathed. I know they breathed." The doctor was never seen again. Some claimed he fled west. Others whispered he had drowned himself in the Potomac. But a darker story lingered, that the boys had come for him. Elias Prescott fared no better. His fields went untended, his livestock starved in their pens. He was often seen muttering in the graveyard, crouched beside his son's plot, as if conversing with them. One night, neighbors reported seeing him kneeling before the headstones, striking the soil with his fists, shouting, "Stop scratching. Stop it! You're dead! You're dead." By winter, he was gone too. Some said he went north to join kin. Others swore he wandered into the woods and never returned. But the grave remained, and the scratching never stopped. Meanwhile, the cursed photograph refused to vanish. What had once appeared only in Harper's Ferry began surfacing in neighboring towns. A copy nailed to a church door in Shepherdstown. Another slipped beneath a tavern door in Winchester. Always the same faded image of the 2 Prescott boys, their expressions locked between silence and scream. One pastor in Maryland swore the photograph arrived folded into his Bible, tucked between Psalms and Lamentations. When he held it up to the congregation, some wept, others fled, and weeks later that pastor's church caught fire. Those who had seen the coffins up close began to unravel. Martha Coates, the little girl who first tripped over the exposed wood, stopped speaking altogether. She sat for hours staring at the church floorboards, lips moving soundlessly. The minister himself took ill. His sermons became fragmented, one week thundering against sin, the next weeping openly at the pulpit. On his deathbed, he whispered to his wife, "They still breathe. Can you hear it? Beneath the boards, always beneath the boards." Even the sheriff, once dismissive, resigned abruptly. He left town under cover of night, abandoning his badge and pistol on his desk. None of them ever truly escaped. By spring of 1859, county officials intervened. All references to the Prescott case were struck from court records. The church logbook skipped over the boys' burial entirely. Even the death certificates were rewritten. Consumption scribbled in ink where blank space had once remained. But the more they tried to erase it, the more persistent the rumors became. Travelers began to detour around Harper's Ferry, whispering of the cursed town. Merchants complained business had dried up. And still the photograph appeared, nailed to barns, pinned to market stalls, floating face up in the river. It was as though the boys themselves refused to be forgotten. By the eve of the Civil War, Harper's Ferry was already fractured by politics, slavery, and looming conflict. But beneath all that was another fracture, quieter, darker. The Prescott case had left a wound that never healed. Families distrusted their doctors. Children feared their parents. Neighbors eyed each other, wondering who might bury secrets next. And when war finally came, some whispered it was no coincidence, that Harper's Ferry, already cursed by the restless dead, was doomed to burn. The last known appearance of the Prescott photograph came in 1863. During the height of the war, Union soldiers, bivouacked near the ruins of Harper's Ferry, claimed they found a weathered image nailed to the trunk of a tree near the churchyard. 2 boys stared from its faded surface, their eyes pale and hollow. The soldiers kept it only long enough to carry it back to camp. That night, their tent caught fire. The photograph was never recovered. But here is where the story twists again. In 1871, more than a decade after the war, a historian digging through estate papers in Charleston uncovered a letter. The handwriting was shaky, but the signature was clear. Elias Prescott. The letter was addressed to his brother in Pennsylvania. Its contents have never been fully published, but fragments leaked into academic journals years later. Among them, they begged me not to bury them. The doctor said it was best. I could still feel warmth in their hands. If true, the letter suggests the unthinkable. Elias Prescott may have known his sons still lived and buried them anyway. But why to silence them? To conceal some greater sin? Or simply because the shame of their survival after being declared dead was too great to endure? The letter ends with 4 words, scrawled in near illegible ink. They are not gone. And so, what began as whispers over a graveyard storm became something else entirely. A story too grotesque for papers to print, too heavy for churches to preach, too shameful for families to claim. The Prescott brothers became legends, but not the kind carved on monuments. Their story was passed in hushed tones, in fragments of rumor, in fading photographs left where no hand admitted placing them. And with each telling, they grew less human, more like symbols of something the town could never escape. The cost of silence, the cruelty of complicity, the punishment of burying truth alongside the living. The Prescott case was no longer just about 2 boys clawing inside a coffin. It was about a town clawing to keep its secrets. But secrets, like the scratching beneath the soil, always find their way to the surface. And what came next would prove even darker. The Prescott brothers were laid in the earth in 1858, but the earth never truly closed over them. What began as whispers in Harper's Ferry became something else entirely. A tale that refused to die, no matter how fiercely officials tried to strangle it. Because stories are like roots. They twist beneath the surface, waiting, pushing upward when you least expect it. And the Prescott story kept breaking through the soil. The first legacy lay in wooden nails. The little churchyard where the Prescott boys were first discovered was shuttered within a decade. Officially, it was for disrepair. The roof leaked, the steeple leaned, the floorboards warped from flood and frost. But the locals knew better. They said the floorboards never stayed quiet, that if you knelt in the church after dusk, you could hear faint scratching beneath the planks. Not from mice, not from settling timber, but from hands that should have stilled a century before. By 1870, the church was abandoned, windows shattered, doors chained, the cemetery fenced off with iron, yet children still dared each other to creep through the fence at night, pressing their ears to the ground, swearing they heard voices. Some came away pale, unable to speak for days. Others returned with fingernail scratches along their arms, though no one ever saw how they got them. The church still stands today, roofless now, swallowed in ivy. But locals do not step inside, not because of what they see, but because of what they hear. For decades, academics tiptoed around the Prescott case. Official records were sparse, court notes redacted, family papers burned. Court notes redacted, family papers burned. But in the 1930s, a young historian named Walter Crane became obsessed. He scoured libraries from Richmond to DC, piecing together fragments, sermons, newspaper clippings, estate inventories. He claimed to have uncovered proof, not just of premature burial, but of deliberate concealment by church and county. Crane prepared a manuscript titled The Prescott Horror. It was never published. The publisher who first reviewed it sent it back with only 3 words scrawled in red ink: "Do not proceed." Weeks later, Crane vanished while traveling to Harper's Ferry. His car was found abandoned near the old churchyard, the driver's side door open, the key still dangling. The manuscript was never recovered. In 1961, during the Civil War centennial events in Harper's Ferry, a tourist from Ohio reported finding a photograph wedged into the cracks of a stone wall near the ruins of the old arsenal. It was small, stained, nearly faded to nothing. But the faces, 2 boys, pale, stiff, with eyes half-lidded, were unmistakable to anyone who knew the Prescott legend. The man handed it to a park ranger, who slipped it into his desk for safekeeping. A week later, the ranger's house caught fire. The desk and everything in it was reduced to ash. The photograph was gone again. Or perhaps simply waiting for the next set of hands. By the late 20th century, the Prescott story had shifted from whispered shame to Appalachian folklore. It was told at bonfires, in ghost tours, in hushed tones on school trips. But the details twisted with each telling. Some said the boys clawed free of their coffins and walked the earth as hollow-eyed revenants. Others swore they were never buried at all, that their father sealed them in a hidden cellar, feeding them scraps until madness claimed them both. In certain versions, the photograph itself became the curse. Whoever kept it too long would see the brothers in their sleep, standing at the foot of the bed, mouths filled with soil. Folklorists catalogued these variations, noting how the tale blurred the line between history and haunting. But the locals never treated it as just a story. To them, the Prescott brothers were still there, not just in the ground, but in the air, the water, the very soil that fed the valley. In the early 2000s, the rise of ghost hunting shows brought new eyes to the legend. Teams armed with infrared cameras and EVP recorders crept into the ruins of the old churchyard, broadcasting their findings to late-night audiences. What they captured was unsettling. A scratching sound picked up on tape, growing louder each time they asked, "Are you there?" A low, gasping moan recorded beneath the floorboards of the church. One investigator swore he felt two small hands grasp his ankles, though the camera showed nothing. Most crews never returned for a second night. One group abandoned the project entirely, their footage unreleased. Their lead investigator later told a radio host, "Some graves aren't meant to be disturbed. Some stories aren't meant to be told." Descendants of the Prescott family still live scattered across Virginia and Pennsylvania. Most refuse to speak of their connection. When pressed, they dismiss it as just a story. But there are hints of deeper unease. One descendant, interviewed anonymously in 1987, admitted that family reunions often included a ritual, a prayer not for the living, but for the brothers we wronged. When asked to elaborate, the descendant ended the interview immediately. Another relative, traced through marriage records, destroyed a local historian's letter that inquired about family diaries. She wrote back only one sentence: "Do not dig where the ground remembers." Even outside Harper's Ferry, the Prescott name carries a weight. Farmers along the Shenandoah claim certain patches of soil will not grow, patches that correspond eerily with old maps of the Prescott property. Construction crews have reported equipment failing near the churchyard, their drills breaking as though the earth itself resisted intrusion. And hikers sometimes stumble upon shallow depressions in the ground, too small for graves, too uneven for erosion. They leave quickly without investigating because everyone knows what might lie beneath. In recent years, the Prescott legend has found new life online. Reddit threads, YouTube channels, and paranormal forums buzz with speculation. Some post supposed sightings of the photograph. Others claim their families once owned land near the Prescotts and that things never grew right there. But amid the noise, certain patterns emerge. Stories of muffled scratching beneath old houses. Nightmares of children gasping for air. A sense that the Prescott brothers are no longer confined to Harper's Ferry, but have become part of a larger tapestry of American folklore. And yet the most chilling posts are always the shortest. Just a photo, just a sound file, just one sentence repeated again and again. They never stopped breathing. So what remains of the Prescott brothers today? No gravestones, no official records, no published books, only a handful of scattered references, a vanished photograph, and a story passed like contraband through generations. But sometimes the things with the least evidence leave the deepest marks. The Prescott case endures not because of what we know, but because of what we fear. The fear that the ground beneath us holds more than soil. The fear that silence can be worse than screams. The fear that death may not always come when we expect it. The Prescott brothers never lived to see the modern world, but the modern world still feels their breath, faint, shallow, muffled beneath the weight of centuries. And those who dare to listen too closely rarely sleep soundly again. Evil doesn't always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it comes quietly. Sometimes it comes with a photograph. Sometimes it comes with the sound of fingernails against wood, faint, desperate, buried too deep for anyone to answer. The Prescott brothers' story forces us to confront a truth most of us try to avoid: that death is not always clean, nor merciful, nor final. We like to believe that when a body is lowered into the earth, peace follows, that families weep, ministers pray, and the soil becomes a blanket of rest. But the Prescotts shattered that illusion. Their story reminds us that graves can lie, those photographs can betray, that the line between life and death can be blurred by error or malice or something far more chilling. Think about what the Prescott case reveals about human trust. Every funeral is an act of faith. Families trust that doctors have declared death correctly. They trust that the undertaker handles the body with dignity. They trust that the graveyard is not just a hole in the ground, but a sacred space. And yet, in 1858, that trust failed, catastrophically. 2 boys were buried before their time. Their lungs still fought. Their hands still clawed. Their eyes still searched for light. It is the worst betrayal imaginable, to be placed in the earth while breath still rattles in your chest. The Prescotts remind us that trust can be fragile, and that sometimes the very institutions meant to protect, the church, the family, the community, are the ones that seal the lid. Perhaps what haunts most is not what the brothers endured, but how the living responded. The sheriff looked away. The minister downplayed the whispers. The neighbors locked their doors and prayed the story would fade. But silence is never neutral. Silence is complicity. Every time someone chose to ignore the scratching in the night, every time someone decided not to question the photograph, the Prescotts were buried again, not just in soil, but in willful forgetting. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. Not the evil of one mistake, but the apathy of many. What does it mean to hold in your hands the image of the Prescotts? It means carrying proof that suffering does not always die with the body. It lingers in frames, in shadows, in the way glass plates trap the last spark of a soul. Photographs are supposed to preserve memory, but in this case, the photograph preserved torment. It immortalized the boys not in peace, but in agony. And for more than a century, it has resurfaced like a curse, appearing, vanishing, always burning those who hold it too long. Maybe that is the real legacy, not a haunting, not a ghost, but a reminder that some images should never have been taken, that some truths should never have been silenced. The Prescott case may feel distant. 1858 is a long time ago, and premature burial belongs to another era. Or does it? Even today, stories emerge of coffins reopening, of bodies discovered with bloodied fingers and contorted faces. Modern medicine has advanced, yes, but error is still possible. And where there is error, there is fear. The Prescotts are not just history. They are a warning that human error and human neglect can conspire to create the most nightmarish fate of all: to be alive and yet entombed. Ask yourself, when you walk past a cemetery at night, why do you feel that shiver? It's not just the thought of ghosts, it's the thought of the living who were mistaken for the dead. It's the thought of breath muffled by earth. It's the thought that beneath your feet, silence might not mean peace. The Prescott brothers never had voices in the end, and so the earth took their cries, keeping them for itself. But sometimes, when the wind moves through the grass, when the ground shifts, when silence grows too heavy, we wonder if the earth still remembers. This is the truth the Prescott story leaves us with. Evil does not always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from neglect, from silence, from a failure to care. Sometimes the deepest horror is not murder, but the indifference that allows suffering to go unheard. The Prescott's tale is not just about 2 brothers in 1858. Scott's tale is not just about 2 brothers in 1858. It is about every choice we make to listen or not to listen. Every time we turn away from a whisper because it is easier to pretend it doesn't exist. And perhaps that is why their legend refuses to die. Because until we confront the silence, until we admit how fragile trust, compassion, and memory truly are, the scratching will continue. Not just beneath the soil of Harper's Ferry, but beneath all of us. So when you lay down tonight in the quiet of your room, remember this. The Prescott brothers were buried once by mistake. They were buried again in silence. And they will keep clawing their way back until someone is brave enough to listen. Because the earth does not forget, and neither should we. Most stories end when the final page is turned. Most graves stay closed once the earth has been packed down. But the Prescott brothers' tale refuses to remain buried. Because the photograph still exists. Not the copy you find blurred on the internet. Not the versions that look like they've been reproduced 100 times through scanners and photocopiers. I'm speaking of the original glass plate, the one that was whispered about, locked away, passed between hands like contraband. For decades, historians claimed it had been lost, destroyed in a fire, misplaced in a courthouse archive, or deliberately broken to erase its curse. But the truth? It never vanished. It merely changed owners. In 1978, at a private estate sale in Richmond, Virginia, a small box of Civil War-era photographs was auctioned. Inside were family portraits, daguerreotypes, and one image that made the bidders recoil. A picture of two boys, thin, sunken, their eyes wide with a kind of terror no studio photographer could have arranged. The auctioneer moved quickly, trying to brush past it. But one collector insisted on buying the entire box. He paid in cash and he asked for no receipt. That collector's name never appeared in official records, but his widow would later confess something strange. She claimed the photograph was kept in a locked drawer in his study, and yet some nights she heard scratching from inside. Not the sound of wood against wood, but the faint drag of nails on glass. In 1994, the photograph surfaced again, quietly. A curator at a small regional museum in Maryland acquired it through an anonymous donor. He believed it was an early example of post-mortem photography, a tragic relic of Victorian mourning customs. He decided to display it for a Halloween exhibition. It lasted less than 3 days. Visitors complained of nausea. Some claimed they felt cold hands brush against them while they looked at the image. One child fainted, muttering something about, "They can't breathe." The exhibit was shut down, and the photograph was pulled. Officially, the museum claimed the plate had deteriorated. But former staff say it was locked away in a vault, never spoken of again. 10 years later, in 2004, a graduate student at the University of Virginia claimed to have traced the photograph to its origin. She wrote in her thesis draft that she had found references to the Prescott brothers in the coroner's ledgers from 1858. But before her work could be defended, she withdrew. Her advisor later admitted that the student had grown paranoid. She told him she saw the boys' faces reflected in mirrors, not as they looked in the photograph, but as they must have looked in their last moments, mouths open, gasping, lungs clawing for air. She left the program and disappeared from academia entirely. To this day, no one knows what happened to her notes. What does this mean for us now? It means the Prescott brothers are not just history. Their story bleeds forward every time someone dares to unearth their image. Every time a new owner believes they can contain the silence trapped in glass. And each time something slips through, the scratching, the whispers, the sudden certainty that someone is buried alive, even now. So I leave you with this question. What if you came across the Prescott photograph? Would you look? Would you risk seeing the truth no one else wants to face? And what if, late at night as you close your eyes, you hear something faint, a sound at the edge of silence? Not outside, not upstairs, but beneath you, a muffled cry, a hand against wood, the final gasp of someone who was never meant to be forgotten. The Prescott brothers' grave may be unmarked. Their story may be fragmented, censored, rewritten, buried again and again. But the photograph remains, and as long as it does, so will the scratching. So tonight, when you turn off the light, ask yourself, are the Prescotts still buried? Or have they been waiting, clawing through time, through history, through silence, for someone to finally listen? Because maybe the photograph isn't just an image. Maybe it's a door, and the Prescotts are still trying to open it. Prescotts are still trying to open it.